Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Sydney, the teen librarian here at Imaginon, and I'm so happy to be here this morning to celebrate Community Read, our month-long community-wide book club where we encourage everyone in the community to read or listen to books of current and relevant topics and to participate in discussions, book clubs, and events hosted by the library and community partners. This year's theme is Food as a Connector. And our YA title is Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet. We're so lucky to have the author here with us today, Laekan Zea Kemp. She is a writer living in Austin, Texas. Her debut novel, Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet, was a 2022 Pure Belle Prix honor recipient. She has 3 objectives when it comes to storytelling: to make people laugh, cry, and crave Mexican food. Yum. Her work celebrates Chicane grit, resilience, creativity, and joy while exploring themes of identity and mental health. So without further ado, let's hand it over to our author to hear from her about food, identity, and storytelling. And stick around because right after that, we'll be doing a Q&A. Take it away, Laekan.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you to everyone who was able to make it this morning. I know it's a little early post daylight savings, but I really appreciate you being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So again, I'm so happy to be here. Special thanks to the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library for making this possible. Again, my name is Laekan Zea Kemp, and I'm a Chicana kidlit author from Austin, Texas. I write a lot about Mexican food, identity, and mental health issues, the first 2 being the focus of our discussion today. So I grew up in Lubbock, Texas, and I actually wrote my first book when I was just 17 years old and still a senior in high school. I then went on to major in creative writing at Texas Tech University. Post-graduation, I actually worked in libraries for many years before deciding to go back to school to get my master's in teaching. Then I spent 5 years teaching English as a second language to students from all over the world. At the same time, during the evenings and on weekends, I was working on my debut novel, Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet. In 2019, I participated in a Twitter pitch contest for diverse creators called DV Pit. A month later, I signed with my agent. Then a month after that, I sold the book to Little Brown young readers. My debut novel, Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet, is a young adult contemporary story told in 2 voices about the power of food, family, first love, and finding where you belong. Penn is an aspiring pastry chef who dreams of continuing her father's cooking legacy despite her parents having different plans. And Xander is living undocumented with his abuelo, both of them estranged from Xander's father, who he is desperate to find. When Xander starts working at Penn's family restaurant, their worlds collide. But when both the restaurant and Xander's immigrant status are threatened, he and Penn must work together to save the place they both call home. So here's a photo of my writing buddies. You might notice Gambit in the background of this video. So I have 2 dogs, one that was adopted after Hurricane Harvey from a shelter in Houston. The other we adopted during the pandemic. And yes, they are both named after X-Men characters. As a writer, I have 3 very specific objectives when it comes to storytelling: to make people laugh, cry, and crave Mexican food. So this presentation really delves into part of my research process for Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet, but also how you can explore your own family's food history in order to learn more about your ancestry and reclaim some parts of your cultural identity that may have been lost. As Americans, unless you're Indigenous, we all come from somewhere else, and food is one of the strongest ties we have to our ancestral homes. In other words, what we put on our plates tells a story about who we are and where we come from. But what if you don't remember where you come from? Some of us have parents or grandparents who have safeguarded those cultural legacies and worked hard to pass on important traditions. But for some of us, our ancestors may have felt the pressure to assimilate, and in order to survive and thrive in the US, they may have lost or left behind some of those cultural traditions. I mentioned in my introduction that I identify as being Chicana. This means that I can trace my family's ancestry back to Mexico, but we've been living in the United States for several generations. But sometimes it can be confusing growing up straddling two different cultures and feeling like you aren't fully immersed in either. I think and speak and read in English, but I also understand my grandparents' Spanglish. I love cheeseburgers and french fries, but I also love tacos and rice and beans. And for many Chicanos, food is one of the few threads still connecting us to our ancestral roots in Mexico. And many of us grew up with very special memories of being in the kitchen while someone prepared a meal or of sitting around the dinner table while people laughed and talked over delicious food. But I never actually had a lot of those memories. There were a few traditional Mexican dishes that my grandmother would make. Obviously, fresh tortillas, also menudo, carne guisada, and fideo. But my grandmother did not actually like to cook. She did it because her kids needed to eat, but there wasn't a big emphasis on sharing traditional recipes or teaching her kids how to cook the recipes she did know. And I think this came from her not having a very close relationship with her own mother, which meant that they just didn't have those traditional bonding moments in the kitchen that often spark a love of cooking. But when my grandmother did cook menudo or make tortillas, I absolutely loved it. And when I went to the homes of my friends and ate their mother's Mexican home cooking, I loved it. And when I was an adult and I could afford to patronize Mexican restaurants whenever I wanted, that love only grew. Especially when I was living in Florida after college and there was no Mexican food in sight. Absence truly did make my heart grow fonder. So, the research for my debut novel actually started long before the story even came to me. I visited panaderias and pastelerias and Mexican restaurants, eating empanadas and elote and maranitos, and tasting these flavors I recognized, but that I'd never eaten in quite those combinations before. All the while, this story was beginning to form in my mind about a girl who dreamed of taking over the family restaurant and a cute new hire who basically falls in love with her at first sight. There was only one problem. In order to tell this story about food and family and cultural legacy in a way that truly did it justice, I was going to have to learn how to cook. Basically, I needed to go from this to this. I subscribed to blogs and YouTube channels of Mexican home chefs. I watched every episode of Patty Hinich's PBS show. I crowdsourced tips and information on Twitter and Facebook. And I really tried to learn the history of each traditional dish, from the symbolic meaning of the ingredients used to the evolution of how those dishes have been prepared over time. But just because you understand how something is made, and even why, doesn't mean that you will be able to make it perfectly yourself. Needless to say, there were many bumps in the road, from creating things that were so spicy they were basically inedible, to fumbling with corn tortillas that would not stop cracking, to getting a crick in my neck from spending 3 days straight making tamales. And every time a dish came out burnt or gross or underdone, it didn't just feel like a technical failure, like the result of not enough practice or of incorrectly following the recipe. It felt like I was failing at being Latina. I know that intellectually this makes no sense. We all know that it takes practice to be good at something. But I wasn't just trying to learn how to cook. I was trying to learn how to cook the food of my people. Because of this, I began to measure my latinidad based on my successes and failures in the kitchen. If a dish turned out great, this was my proof that I was tapping into some kind of ancestral magic. If a dish turned out terribly, this was my proof that I was too American to be able to cook authentic Mexican food. But this way of thinking is wrong. Cooking Mexican food doesn't make me Mexican. In fact, nothing I say or do or think can make me more of what I already am. My ancestry is not something that can be stripped or expanded, it just is. So I stopped using cooking as a measuring stick, and instead I focused on why I was cooking in the first place. Not to prove myself, but to connect with myself and to connect with my family history in a way that would allow me to better understand it. So I said a little prayer to the ancestors, asking them to guide me on my journey. And I committed to the process in earnest, mistakes, messes, and all. And eventually, my research stopped being just about this one book and this one story. Eventually, it started to become a part of my story. And every time I learned something new about a particular dish or ingredient, it felt like I was taking something back. Reclaiming parts of me that had been buried. But the sense of empowerment that came from diving more deeply into my own culture and ancestry weren't the only benefits. The process of cooking itself did wonders for my mental health, especially in the early days of the pandemic when so many things felt like they were outside of my control. And the process of cooking these traditional Mexican dishes that held so much meaning for me personally, well, that did wonders for my heart as well. Research shows that the repetitive movements involved in cooking can often put people in a meditative state. It boosts creativity, increases our sense of control, and most importantly, is an act of self-love. When we cook for ourselves, we are signaling to our bodies that we are worth caring for. Food also communicates love to whoever else we happen to be feeding. It is communal and tribal and symbolic of different people connecting over shared beliefs and values. When we prepare food from our native cultures, not only are we keeping those cultures alive and thriving in the present, but we are also honoring who we are as human beings by sharing that food with others. This was a taste of my journey, but the truth is we all have rich food histories. Maybe your great-great-grandparents are from Ireland or France or Germany or Thailand or Egypt or Sudan. And maybe when your ancestors arrived in the United States, they either chose to leave behind or were forcefully stripped of some of their cultural identity. Maybe food is one of the things your family has lost. But no matter how many generations stand between you and your motherland, you are entitled to those traditions. Those cultural practices still belong to you. Reclaiming these important parts of my cultural identity has been so transformative and honestly one of the best things I have ever done. With these parts of my roots restored, I feel more grounded and connected to both the past and the present. I feel powerful and knowledgeable and like a steward of my own culture. But not only is reconnecting with your ancestral roots through food incredibly accessible thanks to the internet, it's also a lot of fun. But before you begin your own journey through your family's food history, here are some tips. Number 1, believe that you are worthy of reclaiming your cultural identity. Don't get hung up on how separated you are by miles or years from your ancestral homeland. If your grandmother doesn't know how to cook the traditional meals of your native culture, so what? You can absolutely be the one to reintroduce your entire family to these parts of your shared cultural identity. Number 2, do not use cooking as a litmus test for your cultural identity. In other words, don't do what I did and place the weight of your entire cultural identity on how successful you are in the kitchen. Learning a new skill takes practice. Your ancestors didn't come out of the womb knowing how to cook either. They just had the benefit of growing up in close proximity to these traditions. But if you work to reintegrate these cultural practices into your everyday life, future generations of your family will grow up with the same benefits. Number 3, accept that you will make mistakes. Cooking is a creative endeavor, and when you get creative in the kitchen, you are bound to make a few messes. Embrace the mess, laugh off your mistakes, and try again. Number 4, involve your family in the process. Cooking with others is fun. Learning alongside others is also fun. Share in the rewards of exploring your family's food history and involve others in the process. You never know when a certain smell or taste or ingredient will spark a memory in someone that leads to an awesome family story you've never heard before. Or when an afternoon working out a new dish with your loved ones will turn into a memory that lasts a lifetime. Number 5, do your research. There's a reason we love making family trees and listening to our grandparents' stories about their childhood, and why so many of us have purchased those ancestry DNA kits to learn more about where we come from. Family history is a source of pride. Learning about it makes us feel connected to something bigger than ourselves, and what we learn often inspires us in the present. Whether that's by giving us a sense of purpose or just a deeper understanding of why we are the way we are. The research portion of this journey is one of the most exciting, not just because the internet makes it so much easier to learn about far-off places we've never actually stepped foot in, but because it might just inspire you to have conversations with family members unlike any conversations you've had before. Schedule a Zoom call with your grandparents or great aunt and ask them about the foods they grew up eating. Ask them about names on the family tree you don't recognize. Talk to them about how hardship changed their relationship with food. Share with them what you've been reading and learning about. But most importantly, when you call to ask for a recipe and they go off on some long story from when they were kids, just listen. Number 6, learn about the cultural significance of each dish or ingredient. Learning the why of a dish is just as important as learning the how. If you know why certain ingredients were used in a dish or what they symbolize, dishes become tapestries, stories that don't just feed your body, but also your soul. Number 7, notice your emotional reaction. Sometimes when we learn the why of a dish, we end up learning just as much about why our families have a certain core belief, why they share certain fears, and just in general, why we live and behave the way we do. Prepare yourself for powerful revelations about who you are and why. Number 8, put your own twist on things. Remember that cooking is a creative endeavor. If traditional flavors don't jive with your taste buds, make substitutions. If a traditional dish sparks an idea for something brand new, go for it. Deviating from the rules does not make you a traitor or an imposter. And lastly, number 9, have fun. If you're using this process as a measuring stick for your cultural identity, it's going to feel like an impassable test. But if you look at this process as an opportunity to explore and learn and grow, then that's exactly what will happen. I hope this discussion has you excited about learning more about your family's food history, and I hope it has you feeling entitled to that exploration and to that reclamation process, because you deserve to know more about where you come from And with all of the resources that exist, reclaiming those lost pieces of your cultural identity is easier than ever. And if you'd like to connect online, here's where you can find me. And now I think we're going to open it up to some questions.
Yes, thank you, Laekan, for that beautiful presentation. Our first question is, what got you into writing?
So I always loved stories and storytelling, but when I got into school, I think that's when I realized that writing was sort of the only thing that I was really good at. And my mom tried everything. She she put me in dance and gymnastics, every sport you can think of, community theater. She was really dedicated to trying to figure out what my talent was. Um, and I wasn't really good at any of those other things. I didn't really enjoy any of those other things, but it was my teachers who were able to kind of pinpoint that writing was where my strength lied. And this may be true of some of you, but when I finally found something that I was good at, it doing that thing made me feel good about myself, which made me want to write more and more. It built up my confidence. And so that's kind of how it happened. I realized that I was good at writing, that I enjoyed it, and then it made me feel good about myself. And so I just continued to do it.
Yeah, that's good because if I understand you correctly, you said you wrote your first book in high school.
I did, yeah, when I was 17 years old during my senior year. And then when I got into college, I majored in creative writing. And there was one semester where I was able to do like this independent study course where I was able to take that book that I wrote during my senior year and I was able to finish it and revise it with like a mentor kind of helping me. So I worked on it, for a couple of years and nothing really ever came of that book, but it was a good place to start.
And I know that gives a lot of our like our audience that we're on here with now are in high school, and so that gives them a lot of hope that if you could do it and you became like this published author, they can do it as well. So that's really good and it's very inspiring.
Thanks. Yeah. I feel like the hardest part of writing a book is just finishing, like being able to start, have the dedication, the perseverance to get to the end. And so the sooner you can kind of practice that piece and building up that endurance, the better.
And that's good because that was our next question. What was the biggest challenge of writing this book? So I know you said it's kind of challenging just writing a book in general, but
Mm-hmm.
what is the biggest challenge of writing somewhere between bitter and sweet?
I'm trying to remember, I just sent what will be my 7th novel off to my agent last week. And every time I finish a book, it's sort of like it gets wiped from my memory, um, which is kind of the only way that I'm able to do the process over again because it is so difficult. I think with somewhere between bitter and sweet, I think what was even more difficult than the writing process of that book was just going through the debut experience of traditionally publishing a book for the first time and learning all of the new skills that come with that, all of the new challenges that come with that. So that's what I remember most about being difficult about that book is just like kind of the whole process and the newness of everything in terms of being an author.
Okay, that's good. So our next question, what author do you look up to?
So my favorite author of all time, her name is Melina Marchetta, and I tell this story often, so some of you may have heard it before, but when I was maybe 12 or 13 years old, I remember walking through my local library and seeing her name on the cover of a book and immediately thinking like, oh my gosh, she's Latina. and getting so excited. Turns out she's not Latina. She's actually Australian Italian. But I checked out her books and read them regardless. And it turned out that the Italian immigrant community in Australia, which she writes a lot about, has faced a lot of discrimination that's very similar to what I feel like Mexican Americans face in the United States. So I did end up connecting really deeply with the stories that she wrote and the characters that she wrote about. So it was sort of serendipitous that I ended up picking up her books. But she has so many amazing books. I highly recommend them. She has contemporary, she has high fantasy. She is just writes, across genres and age categories. And whenever it was time in the publication process for Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet, for me to request author blurbs, which is basically just getting like other authors that you admire to write a positive review of your book, I decided, that my pie in the sky sort of dream would be to get Melina to blurb my book. And she's not really in the public so much. She's a very private person, so I didn't think it was really going to be possible. I more so just wanted the opportunity to be able to write her a letter, tell her what she meant to me, what her work has meant to me. And obviously through my publisher, it would be easier to get that letter to her. So yeah, I wrote her a letter telling her, how much I loved her work. And she actually ended up blurbing Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet. So for me, that will always be like the highlight of that publication experience, because she is my literary hero. And yeah, I will just cherish that forever, I think.
That's a sweet story. It's really good.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you hope people can take away from Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet after reading the book?
Yeah, so whenever I'm writing, those sort of like themes that come through, they kind of come through by accident, actually. So I don't necessarily go into the writing process with some kind of moral lesson that I want people to take away from the story. I more so just kind of in general, thinking about all of my work, what I hope people take from it is that, especially if you're not a Latinx reader, you maybe don't share the cultural identity of the characters in the book, that you just develop an appreciation for the culture and for Latinx people. I think, there's always a lot of discourse during election year about the Latinx community. And sometimes negative rhetoric can have a negative impact in the real world. And that is one thing that I am always thinking about when I'm writing, is how I would like these stories, to get into the right hands and just make people more compassionate, more empathetic. And then for those readers who are Latinx and who do share cultural identity with the characters that I write about, that they feel proud and seen.
That's a great answer. When I was reading the book, I did start to gain some empathy in areas that I didn't necessarily have. And I was like, how did she come up with some of this stuff? And like with the loan shark, I was like, in the dad and the daughter's relationship, because you don't really see a dad and daughter like strained relationship after they've been together in the home. And I was just like, I couldn't stop reading it. I was like, okay, I'm going to have to read another chapter. I'm going to have to read another chapter. So I totally think that I took that away. If no one else did, that was a great lesson. So why is incorporating food into your writing important to you?
So one of the things that I mentioned in the presentation is how I feel like for a lot of Chicanos, especially for those of us who've lived in the United States for many generations, food is sometimes the only cultural tie that we still have to our ancestral home. And I know in my family, that's been the case. For example, when it comes to language, my grandparents purposely chose not to teach my mom and her siblings Spanish. Therefore, she did not teach me the language. And I think that's a perfect example of how, assimilation has caused us to lose some of these cultural touchstones. But food is one of the things that we were able to hold on to. And so I think that's why it has such a personal importance to me. And I think that's why it shows up in my writing so much, because when I'm trying to kind of ground myself in the cultural elements of whatever story I'm telling, that is really my starting point. Food is my starting point.
Yeah, that's good. How long was the process to write the book from start to finish?
Oh, let me try and remember. For somewhere between bitter and sweet, it definitely took longer than is typical for me now. Now it takes me about 8 months to write a first draft, which is still kind of slow compared to some of my colleagues. But for somewhere between bitter and sweet, I want to say that I started over from scratch maybe 3 times. And what stuck around was the characters, but the plot and the circumstances changed every time, because I couldn't figure out what circumstances I wanted to drop them into, what was going to work the best. So it took many iterations for me to actually get to a strong draft. So, gosh, I want to say maybe it took a couple of years for me to just draft it on my own. And then obviously once I sold the book, I did even more revisions with an editor, which probably took another 6 months.
And you said the characters stayed the same. Did their names stay the same as well, or did you change the names throughout?
I think the names stayed the same. Names come to me pretty early on in the process. Sometimes they're the very first thing that comes to me. So I'm pretty sure those stayed the same.
Okay. And what about the family dynamic? Did that stay the same as well?
No, I don't think so. I think in the first iteration of the book, the issues had less to do with the parents.
Okay.
I don't even really remember what was going on with the parents in my first version of the story. They may not have really been present at all. But to be honest, that was like a completely different book that I was writing with just the same characters. So yeah, I'm not sure if they were even there. And I don't really remember like when I decided to incorporate the parents and have that be a central part of the conflict. I will say that some of what Penn goes through with her parents is taken from my personal life. So at some point I made the decision to go there, which honestly happens with most of my books. Like now that I've sort of streamlined my process a little bit, I do tend to start with a question that I'm trying to answer, a problem that I'm trying to work out, a past experience that I'm trying to process emotionally. My writing does kind of start from a very self-centered place. Like, what do I need to figure out through this writing process? And then that sort of guides me. So at some point, I must have been like, you know what? I need to process this, trauma from my personal life. Let me just give this to Penn and then, have her go through it, and maybe I'll find some healing through that.
Because it was very detailed. The writing was very detailed. So I thought it had came from somewhere, but I was like, I didn't want to get too personal and say like, is this based off of a real story? So I was just like, okay, it could have just been all like an imagination.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely took a lot of creative liberties, but I think the core of, especially like that scene with Penn and her mom at the kitchen table where Penn's mother basically kicks her out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, I say that was like the core
Mm-hmm.
of what I was drawing from. And then I just kind of built everything out from there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what are you currently reading?
So I'm currently reading Witch of Wild Things by Raquel Vasquez Gilliland. It's an adult sort of fantasy romance. I have made sort of a commitment this year that I am mostly going to be reading books by other Latinx authors.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think this is my fourth read of the year. I'm kind of a slow reader. But yeah, I'm really enjoying it so far. I love Raquel Vasquez Gilliland. She has some YA novels too. How Moon Fuentes Fell in Love with the Universe, and gosh, what's her first book called? Cia Martinez and the Moonlit Beginning of Everything. So her books are really good if you like magic and romance.
You said you're a slow reader, so you're talking about from January until March, you've read 4 books?
I would take that back. I would say 5, but yeah.
That's fast.
Well, I mean, it is part of my job. So, I have time dedicated to it that maybe the normal person doesn't. But I feel like a slow reader because I'm, part of the bookish community, and there's so many people in the bookish community who read like 100, 200 books a year. And that is not me. Like I really do like to savor the language while I'm reading. And so whether I'm reading a physical book or listening to an audiobook, like I really like to take my time. I know there's some people who like when they listen to audiobooks, they'll like speed it up to like 3 times X speed because I think their goal is mostly like just reading for content and, they just want to get the gist. But because I'm a working writer, like it's important for me to immerse myself a little bit deeper in a text so I can see what the writer is doing, and just kind of study it while I'm reading. So I do like to take my time. So yeah, I feel like it's slow, but you're probably right. I'm probably much faster than I think I am.
Yeah, because I'm a librarian and people think that I read all day and I don't.
Yeah.
We don't read all day at all. It takes me a while. Like I think I'm maybe on my 3rd book for this year. So
yeah, I do like 95% of my reading through audiobooks. And I do the majority of my reading when I take my dogs on their daily walk. So I do take them for a while. We go for like an hour and a half, but that's how I get my reading in.
Yeah, that's good. So our next question, what inspired you to write Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet?
Yeah, so we already talked about kind of the personal element and how there was obviously that personal experience that I wanted to kind of unpack and process. Some of the other elements in particular, like the restaurant and the, cast of secondary characters that is pretty vibrant and present in the book, that was really inspired by my partner. He worked in a restaurant when we were in high school, and he used to just tell me like the most hilarious stories of like all the antics they would get up to. And so that really intrigued me. I just wanted to explore those relationships. I wanted to explore like what is it like working in a place like that where it's mostly teenagers and they're kind of creating their own subculture a little bit, like with their games and their rituals and all of these different things. I thought that was so interesting, so I wanted to explore that too. So those are really the 2 main pieces that came together that inspired this book.
That's good. We have a few more questions. Okay, so when you found out that your book was selected for the community read title here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library, what was your one-word reaction?
Surprise? Yeah. I am always pleasantly surprised when my books get selected for anything, when they're highlighted in any way, mostly because, my book is not, any of my books, none of them are what we call lead titles in publishing,
Mhm.
meaning they don't really have a lot of support from the publisher themselves.
Mhm.
And so anytime people in the community decide to celebrate them in any way, that means a lot to me, because you had to go out of your way first to find the books and, find out that they exist and that I exist. But then you had to, make the effort to read it, to share it. Like, that is all so impressive and meaningful to me.
Okay, that's good. And that wraps up our Q&A. Thank you so much for being so open and vulnerable, and sharing your presentation with us. These were questions that we received from the public. So if for our teens out there, our high schoolers out there, if you did not get a chance to submit a question, or if your question wasn't selected for Laekan to answer during this Q&A session, she is going to be back again this week on Thursday, on our Instagram page. So that's going to be at CM Library Teens on Instagram this Thursday at 6 p.m. So you'll be able to swipe up and be able to ask questions. She won't have a presentation if I'm not mistaken, but if she does, it would be different. But you'll be able to ask any type of questions that you have. And also, the library does still have copies at some of our locations. If you would like a copy of her book, it is free. So visit your local library. And we hope that you enjoyed everything. Special thanks to you, Laekan, for everything, joining us all the way from Texas. So I know there's a time difference. So we just appreciate everything. We hope that you all have a great rest of your day. Laekan, do you have anything else?
No, I'm just excited to see everybody on Thursday. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining. Happy reading.
Bye.
Bye.